Socrates. Next, then, compare the effect of education and that of the lack of it on our nature to an experience like this. Imagine human beings living in an underground cave-like dwelling, with an entrance a long way up that is open to the light, and as wide as the cave itself. They have been there since childhood, with their necks and legs fettered, so that they are fixed in the same place, able to see only in front of them, because their fetter prevents them from turning their heads around. Light is provided by a fire burning far above and behind them. Between the prisoners and the fire, there is an elevated road stretching. Imagine that along this road a low wall has been built, like the screen in front of people that is provided by puppeteers, and above which they show their puppets. Glaucon. I am imagining it. Socrates. Also imagine then that there are people alongside the wall carrying multifarious artifacts that project above it statues of people and other animals, made of stone, wood, and every material. And as you would expect, some of the carriers are talking, and some are silent. Glaucon. It is a strange image you are describing, and strange prisoners. Socrates. They are like us. I mean, in the first place, do you think these prisoners have ever seen anything of themselves and one another besides the shadows that the fire casts on the wall of the cave in front of them? Glaucon. How could they, if they have to keep their heads motionless throughout life? Socrates. What about the things carried along the wall? Isn't the same true where they are concerned? Glaucon. Of course. Socrates. And if they could engage in discussion with one another, don't you think they would assume that the words they used apply to the things they see passing in front of them? Glaucon. They would have to. Socrates. What if their prison also had an echo from the wall facing them? When one of the carriers passing along the wall spoke, do you think they would believe that anything other than the shadow passing in front of them was speaking? Glaucon. I do not, by Zeus. Socrates. All in all, then, what the prisoners would take for true reality is nothing other than the shadows of these artifacts. Glaucon. That's entirely inevitable. Socrates. Consider, then, what being released from their bonds and cured of their foolishness would naturally be like if something like this should happen to them. When one was freed and suddenly compelled to stand up, turn his neck around, walk, and look up towards the light, he would be pained by doing all these things and be unable to see the things whose shadow he had seen before, because of the flashing lights. What do you think he would say if we told him that what he had seen before was silly nonsense, but that now, because he is a bit closer to what is, and is turned toward things that are more, he sees more correctly? And in particular, if we pointed to each of the things passing by and compelled him to answer what each of them is, don't you think he would be puzzled and believe that the things he saw earlier were more truly real than the ones he was being shown? Glaucon. Much more so. Socrates. And if he were compelled to look at the light itself, wouldn't his eyes be pained, and wouldn't he turn around and flee toward the things he is able to see, and believe that they are really clearer than the ones he is being shown? Glaucon. He would. Socrates. And if someone dragged him by force away from there, along the rough, steep upward path, and did not let him go, until he had dragged him into the light of the sun, wouldn't he be pained and angry at being treated that way? And when he came into the light, wouldn't he have his eyes filled with sunlight, and be unable to see a single one of the things now said to be truly real? Glaucon. No, he would not be able to, at least not right away. Socrates. He would need time to get adjusted, I suppose, if he is going to see the things in the world above. At first, he would see shadows most easily, then images of men and other things in water. than the things themselves. From these it would be easier for him to go on to look at the things in the sky, and the sky itself at night, gazing at the light of the stars and the moon, than during the day, gazing at the sun and the light of the sun. Glaucon, of course. Socrates. Finally, I suppose, he would be able to see the sun, not reflections of it in water or some alien place, but the sun just by itself in its own place, and be able to look at it and see what it is like. Glaucon. Necessarily. Socrates. After that, he would already be able to conclude about it, that it provides the seasons and the years, governs everything in the visible world, and is in some way the cause of all the things that he and his fellows used to see. Glaucon. That would clearly be his next step. Socrates. What about when he reminds himself of his first dwelling place, what passed for wisdom there, and his fellow prisoners? Don't you think he would count himself happy for the change and pity the others? Glaucon. Certainly. Socrates. And if there had been honors, praises, or prizes among them for the one who was sharpest at identifying the shadows as they passed by, and was best able to remember which usually came earlier, which later, and which simultaneously, and who was thus best able to prophesize the future, do you think that our man would desire these rewards or envy those among the prisoners who were honored and held power? Or do you think he would feel with Homer that he would much prefer to work the earth as a serf for another man, a man without possessions of his own, and go through any sufferings rather than share their beliefs and live as they do? Glaucon. Yes, I think he would rather suffer anything than live like that. Socrates. Consider this too, then. If this man went back down into the cave and sat down in his same seat, wouldn't his eyes be filled with darkness, coming suddenly out of the sun like that? Glaucon. Certainly. Socrates. Now if he had to compete once again with the perpetual prisoners in recognizing the shadows, while his sight was still dim and before his eyes had recovered, and if the time required for readjustment was not short, wouldn't he provoke ridicule? Wouldn't it be said of him that he had returned from his upward journey with his eyes ruined, and that it is not worth while even to try to travel upward? And as for anyone who tried to free the prisoners and lead them upward, if they could somehow get their hands on him, wouldn't they kill him? Glaucon. They certainly would. Socrates. This image, my dear Glaucon, must be fitted together as a whole with what we said before. The realm revealed through sight should be likened to the prison dwelling, and the light of the fire inside it to the sun's power. And if you think of the upward journey and the seeing of things above as the upward journey of the soul to the intelligible realm, you won't mistake my intention, since it is what you wanted to hear about. Only the God knows whether it is true. But this is how these phenomena seem to me. In the knowable realm, the last thing to be seen is the form of the good, and it is seen only with toil and trouble. Once one has seen it, however, one must infer that it is the cause of all that is correct and beautiful in anything, and that in the visible realm it produces both light and its source, and that in the intelligible realm it controls and provides truth and understanding, and that anyone who is to act sensibly in private or public must see it. Glaucon. I agree so far as I am able. Socrates. Come on then, and join me in this further thought. You should not be surprised that the ones who get to this point are not willing to occupy themselves with human affairs, but on the contrary, their souls are always eager to spend their time above. I mean, that is surely what we would expect, if indeed the image I described before is also accurate here. Glaucon. It is what we would expect. Socrates. What about when someone, coming from looking at divine things, looks to the evils of human life? Do you think it is surprising that he behaves awkwardly and appears completely ridiculous if, while his sight is still dim and he has not yet become accustomed to the darkness around him, he is compelled, either in the courts or elsewhere, to compete about the shadows of justice, or about the statues of which they are shadows, and to dispute the way these things are understood by people who have never seen justice itself? Glaucon. It is not surprising at all. Socrates. On the contrary, anyone with any sense, at any rate, would remember that eyes may be confused in two ways and from two causes, when they change from the light into the darkness, or from the darkness into the light. If he kept in mind that the same applies to the soul, then when he saw a soul disturbed and unable to see something, he would not laugh absurdly. Instead, he would see whatever it had come from a brighter life and was dimmed through not having yet become accustomed to the dark, or from greater ignorance into greater light, and was dazzled by the increased brilliance. Then he would consider the first soul happy in its experience in life, and pity the latter. But even if he wanted to ridicule it, at least his ridiculing it would make him seem less ridiculous than ridiculing a soul that had come from the light above. Glaucon. That's an entirely reasonable claim. Socrates. Then here is how we must think about these matters. If that is true, education is not what some people boastfully profess it to be. They say that they can pretty much put knowledge into souls that lack it, like putting sight into blind eyes. Glaucon. Yes, they do say that. Socrates. But here is what our present account shows about this power to learn that is present in everyone's soul, and the instrument with which each of us learns. Just as an eye cannot be turned around from darkness to light except by turning the whole body, so this instrument must be turned around from what comes to be together with the whole soul, until it is able to bear to look at what is, and at the brightest thing that is, the one we call the good. Isn't that right? Glaucon. Yes. Socrates. Of this then, of this very turning around, there would be a craft concerned with how this instrument can be most easily and effectively turned around, not of putting sight into it. On the contrary, it takes for granted that sight is there, though not turned in the right way or looking where it should look, and contrives to redirect it appropriately. Glaucon. That's probably right. Socrates. The other so-called virtues of the soul, then, do seem to be closely akin to those of the body. They really are not present in it initially, but are added later by habit and practice. The virtue of wisdom, on the other hand, belongs above all, so it seems, to something more godlike, which never loses its power, but is either useful and beneficial or useless and harmful, depending on the way it is led around. Or haven't you ever noticed in people who are said to be bad but clever, how sharp the vision of their little soul is, and how sharply it distinguishes the things it is turned toward? This shows that its sight is not inferior, but is compelled to serve vice, so that the sharper it sees, the more evils it accomplishes. Skipping over some parts here. Socrates. Then isn't this at last, Glaucon, the theme itself that dialectical discussion sings? It itself is intelligible, but the power of sight imitates it. We said that sight tries at last to look at the animals themselves, the stars themselves, and in the end, at the sun itself. In the same way, whenever someone tries by means of dialectical discussion, and without the aid of any sense perceptions, to arrive through reason at the being of each thing itself, and does not give up until he grasps what good itself is. With understanding itself, he reaches the end of the intelligible realm, just as the other reached the end of the visible one. Glaucon. Absolutely. Socrates. Well then, don't you call this journey dialectic? Glaucon. I do. Socrates, then the release from bonds and the turning around from shadows to statues, and the light, and then the ascent out of the cave to the sun, and there the continuing inability to look directly at the animals, the plants, and the light of the sun, but instead at divine reflections in water, and shadows of the things that are, and not, as before merely at shadows of statues, thrown by another source of light that, when judged in relation to the sun, is as shadowy as they. All this practice of the crafts we mentioned has the power to lead the best part of the soul upward, until it sees the best among the things that are, just as before the clearest thing in the body was led to the brightest thing in the bodily and visible world. Glaucon. I accept that this is so, and yet I think it is very difficult to accept, although in another way difficult not to accept. All the same, since the present occasion is not our only opportunity to hear these things, but we will get to return to them often in the future, let's assume that what you said about them just now is true, and turn to the theme itself and discuss it in the same way as we did the prelude. So then tell us, in what way the power of dialectical discussion works, into what kinds is it divided, and what roads it follows. I mean, it is these, it seems, that would lead us at last to that place which is a rest from the road, so to speak, where the one who reaches it and an end of his journey. Socrates. You won't be able to follow me any farther, my dear Glaucon, though not because of any lack of eagerness on my part. You would no longer see an image of what we are describing, but the truth itself, as it seems to me at least. Whether it is really so or not, that's not something on which it is any longer worth insisting. But that there is some such thing to be seen, that is something on which we must insist. Isn't that so? Glaucon. Of course. Socrates. And mustn't we also insist that the power of dialectical discussion could reveal it only to someone experienced in the subjects we described? Cannot do so in any other way? Glaucon. Yes, that is worth insisting on too. Socrates. At the very least, no one will dispute our claim by arguing that there is another road of inquiry that tries to acquire a methodical and wholly general grasp of what each thing itself is. By contrast, all the other crafts are concerned with human beliefs and appetites, with growing or construction, or with the care of growing and constructed things. As for the rest, we described them as to some extent grasping what is. I mean geometry and the subjects that follow it. For we saw that while they dream about what is, they cannot see it, while wide awake, as long as they make use of hypotheses that they leave undisturbed, and for which they cannot give any account. After all, when the first principle is unknown, and the conclusion and the steps in between are put together, out of what is unknown, what mechanism could possibly turn any agreement, reached in such cases, into knowledge? Glaucon. None. Socrates. Therefore, dialectic is the only method of inquiry that, doing away with hypotheses, journeys to the first principle itself in order to be made secure. And when the eye of the soul is really buried in a sort of barbaric bog, dialectic gently pulls it out and leads it upward, using the craft we described to help it and cooperate with it, in turning the soul around. From force of habit, we have often called these branches of knowledge, but they need another name, since they are clearer than belief and darker than knowledge. We distinguished them by the term thought somewhere before, But I don't suppose we will dispute about names, with matters as important as those before us to investigate. Glaucon. Of course not. Just as long as they express the state of clarity the soul possesses. Socrates, it will be satisfactory then to do what we did before and call the first section knowledge, the second thought, the third opinion, and the fourth imagination. The last two together we call belief, the other two understanding. Belief is concerned with becoming, understanding with being, and as being is to becoming, so understanding is to belief, and as understanding is to belief, so knowledge is to belief, and thought to imagination. But as for the ratios between the things these deal with, and the division of either the believable or the intelligible section into two, let's pass them by, Glaucon, in case they involve us in discussions many times longer than the ones we have already gone through. Glaucon. I agree with you about the rest of them anyway, insofar as I am able to follow. Socrates. So don't you too call someone a dialectician when he is able to grasp an account of the being of each thing? And when he cannot do so, won't you too say that to the extent that he cannot give an account of something either to himself or to another, to that extent he does not understand it? Glaucon. How could I not? Socrates. Then the same applies to the good. Unless someone can give an account of the form of the good, distinguishing it from everything else, and can survive all examination as if in a battle, striving to examine things, not in accordance with belief, but in accordance with being, and can journey through all that with his account still intact, you will say that he does not know the good itself or any other good whatsoever. And if he does not manage to grasp some image of it, you will say that it is through belief, not knowledge, that he grasps it, that he is dreaming and asleep throughout his present life, and that before he wakes up here, he will arrive in Hades and go to sleep forever. Glaucon. Yes, by Zeus, I will certainly say all that.